Assalamu alaikum again, everyone, and welcome to the final session for the day. This session will speak about Pakistan's role in a rapidly evolving regional and global context. And we have a very august panel of experts that have gathered from around the world. I'm very grateful to them for having flown all the way here, some of them in dire circumstances, as we found out. But under all of the considerations, it's really good to see all of you. Dr. Marcus and Shahab I saw in Sri Lanka recently. Adam I saw in Istanbul about 3 months back. And Dr. Amna, who recently just returned from Afghanistan. I'll give very brief introductions for everyone because we're also starting off late, so I want to get right to the conversation. We have Dr. Marcus King. He is a professor of practice in environment and international affairs at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he teaches in the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program. Thank you very much, Dr. King, for being here. Welcome to Pakistan. It's his first trip to Pakistan. We have my very good, very dear friend, Adam Weinstein, who is the Deputy Director of the Middle East Program at the Quincy Institute of Responsible Statecraft. Adam is also a non-resident fellow at the Bad Lab, that's my firm, and he has assisted us in a range of different knowledge products. Him and I have also produced a podcast about 3 years back called The Audit, which specifically looks at Pakistan and US relations. And his policy focus is very much Afghanistan and Pakistan, along with certain key hotspots within the Middle East. He's recently also spent quite a bit of time in Syria, so I'm very keen to get some of his feedback in terms of how he sees the situation evolving. We have Dr. Shahab Khan, professor at the Bangladesh University of Professionals. He's a professor of international relations. He also contributes to the Faculty of Security and Strategic Studies, and he's the chief executive officer of the Bangladesh Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs. That part specifically, I think, is really going to come in handy as we talk about some of the regional imbalances that exist within South Asia. Thank you so much, Dr. Shahab, for coming all the way from Dhaka. Very happy to have you here. Welcome to Pakistan. And finally, Dr. Amna Khan, who is the director for the Center of Afghanistan, Middle East, and Africa at the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad. As I mentioned earlier, Amna has just returned about 2 or 3 weeks back from Afghanistan. She went to Kabul, she went to Kandahar, she went to Mazar Sharif, and I'm sure all of us will greatly benefit from her inputs in this particular discussion. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I'll start off by saying that Pakistan finds itself at a very interesting crossroads. There's a lot of different things that have happened within the last 4 to 6 months that have kind of redefined Pakistan's role both in the region and globally. Principal among them, of course, was the so-called 5-day war between Pakistan and India that happened all the way back in May, and the complete reversal in terms of the perceptions of the two countries, particularly in the West, but also in other places. Then, more recently, there has been the CPEC 2 deal with China, the minerals deal with the US, the defense pact with Saudi Arabia. Then there's other regional elements that are happening. For example, Iran's influence declining in the region as Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis are systematically dismantled by the war machine, as well as the rise of Turkey in the region. Then the fact that the Assad regime, after many, many long decades, has finally been ousted from Syria. So there's a lot of changes that are happening within the Middle East. Pakistan seems to be poised at just the right intersection for all of these developments, right? Pakistan needs to capitalize on everything that has happened with India and the strategic dysfunction that seems to exist there. It needs to capitalize on the economic opportunity presented by walking that very tight line between US interests and Chinese interests in the area. And for the first time, it seems that Pakistan is on good terms with the US, with China, with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries in general, and also with Iran, which is a strange sort of intersection to find ourselves in. Adam, I'll start off with you because you've spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan. And my starting question to you is perhaps the simplest one. What does Pakistan need to do at this particular moment in time to ensure that these opportunities that have presented themselves regionally and globally are capitalized upon and Pakistan emerges as a responsible sovereign in the midst of all of this?
Well, first of all, thank you to Punjab Group for putting this on, and Indus Conclave, and to Badlab as well. And you know, it is a simple question in some sense, because I think Pakistan just needs to keep doing what it's been doing, which is demonstrating that it's a responsible regional actor, as it did in the recent mini war, we could call it, with India, where it came out looking like the more responsible actor. And in terms of the pact that it has with Saudi Arabia, I think it's actually quite interesting, because Pakistan is now going to be a stabilizing factor in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, which is ironic in some sense, because in the past, the Gulf in the Middle East has been a destabilizing factor within the borders of Pakistan. But now times have changed, and Pakistan is going to be the stabilizing actor. And of course, if other countries, for example, Qatar, were to join that pact, I think it would be even more profound. What Pakistan needs to do, though, when you look at these deals such as CPEC-2 or a potential mineral agreement with the United States, is to ensure that these photo ops don't remain just photo ops, but that Pakistan creates the domestic conditions under which these agreements and these deals can actually come to fruition and benefit ordinary Pakistanis. If I had a criticism of Pakistan, it's that Pakistan is often good at getting the photo op, having the conceptual idea, but lacks follow-through. And that's a matter of governance. And I think there's been some improvements, but I think there's still, well, you would know better than I what needs to be done at the micro level. But I think that it's absolutely crucial that Pakistan ensures that these agreements actually come to fruition.
No, that's a very valid point, and also because, so effectively what you're saying is we're very good at getting into the room, but not necessarily in finalizing the deal. But in my experience, also in the past, at moments when we have finalized deals, even past that point, the execution of that, there have been elements that have been lacking, and there's certainly things that we could do better. The session right before this was on devolution, and we spoke quite a bit about governance challenges in Pakistan and how we can improve those. But let's move the conversation to be a little more regional in nature. Pakistan and India, what happened in May happened in May. There was clearly a disconnect between the strategic and sovereign autonomy that India thought it enjoyed, and there was dysfunction with tactical sort of, capacity. South Asia is a region that very often comes into focus, particularly since 2014, after the Trans-Pacific Pact, in which India was poised by the US as the key counterweight to China. And then certain other groups were formed, like the Quad, like the AUKUS. And the central idea was China is a major existential threat to global hegemony for the US. And in order to counter it regionally, at the very least, India should be propped up as that power. The result of that, effectively, was that India could, for example, buy Russian oil right after the Ukraine war and increase its consumption of Russian oil by 20x without facing any kind of international consequences. And that, in many ways, made India one of the most strategically and autonomous sort of sovereigns out there. But that seems to be very rapidly reversing, especially under Trump, especially when you look at the thing that happened in May, as well as the tariffs regime that Modi and Trump have been going back and forth on. My question to you, Professor Shahab, as long as Pakistan is in the mix, we understand that there's not going to be parity because India is an economic superpower. If you look at the Merrill Lynch report, they're going to be the third largest economy in the world by 2030. But there will never be hegemony. It does seem to me that at the same time, Bangladesh has emerged as this economic counterweight, even within the confines of the India-China rivalry, and has successfully managed to capitalize in terms of exports, in terms of education. What are some of the key lessons that you feel are there in Bangladesh that could be applied to Pakistan? And what are some of the, I'll come to the second question a little bit later, but I'm also keen in exploring what are some of the commonalities that Pakistan and Bangladesh could work together that don't necessarily impinge on each other's rights or other regional powers in the mix?
Thank you, Zeeshan. Thank you, Punjab Group, for inviting me. I think you have asked a very, very important question. I think three sets of questions. Before I answer that, we really need to understand what's happening in South Asia. I mean, if I take three countries, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, has a very complex interdependence with China. I mean, even if you look at Indian trade with China, it's almost $125 billion with $90 billion trade deficit in favor of Beijing. So I think that's one ground reality that has always been missing in South Asian discourse when it comes to the term that you have used as becoming economic superpower. The problem of that interdependency in the case of India is that the benefit of that kind of trade relationship or international relationship hasn't really trickled down to the bottom. So what it means, there is a huge gap between the projected income and then the ripple over effect of that income. And in that case, I think Bangladesh has done numerously well because the economy per capita income is at par with the Indians, and therefore, I think we have done quite well. The second important issue when it comes to South Asia is that geopolitics has absolutely changed. I mean, one issue that Pakistan was heavily underemphasized by looking into it from a very donor perspective, looking into economics being in a difficult situation. But when it comes to the geopolitical fulcrum, the rise of Pakistan, or perhaps sustained contribution of Pakistan, silently, openly, discreetly, indiscreetly, in stabilizing the Muslim world, has been of paramount importance. I mean, while there are controversies regarding terrorism and stuff, but if you look at what's happening between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, is a classic example of Pakistan being the only Muslim nuclear power having a clear-cut agenda with the Middle Eastern stability. And I think this is something that many other countries within South Asia has not been able to do. So I think that is one critical issue that we have to be mindful, and which makes not only Beijing comfortable, also makes Washington comfortable, because Pakistan's engagement with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and GCC has widely been accepted by White House as well as Beijing. So I think that has made Pakistan one of the critical elements. Now, this is exactly where Bangladesh comes in. I mean, you have rightly mentioned, where do we find the common ground? I think the first common ground is that Bangladesh also has a similar relationship with Beijing and Washington, as you have rightly mentioned, that the tariff cut was absolutely fantastic, 19% compared to many other countries. And then, of course, Bangladesh's relationship with Beijing has never been hitched and never been into suspicion prism of Washington as such. Of course, there's always some sort of concern in any relationship, whether it is Beijing, Islamabad, or Delhi, Islamabad, or Delhi, Dhaka. And I think we have done fairly well. This is where I think we have some sort of common ground that balancing through geoeconomics and geopolitics is possible, and we have shown that. The third important factor, which I think is very critical over here, is South Asia Gulf interlock. I mean, if you look at Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, all of us are exporter of human resources to the Middle East. And we have a huge diaspora trade and investment going on. And I think that makes us quite acceptable to the geopolitical changes that is happening within the upper leadership, within the Gulf, is something that we should be very, very concerned, not concerned, should be very, very much looking into. Bangladesh is, for an example, remittance is very much coming from Gulf countries. So is India's. So therefore, I think the relationship between Pakistan and the Gulf, and Bangladesh's relationship with the Gulf, and the India's relationship with the Gulf has similar converging point. But the problem remains is that Pakistan sees Gulf from much more of a socio-cultural, political, strategic, every point of view. Bangladesh sees it from a very economic point of view, and India sees it from both political and strategic and economic point of view. Now, what makes everything common is economics. And I think this is where, if the Gulf countries focus that, okay, these are the three countries having not the best relationship over the past few years, and particularly after changes in government in Bangladesh on the 5th of August. The relationship between Bangladesh and India, I will say, is in the best shape, right? And I think that is not good in a sense that the trade has to continue. Investment has to continue. It's a 1.4 billion population. We have 180 million population. Pakistan has 180 plus million population. And I think the whole synergy of the population can create a market which surpasses most of the markets we have looked into. And the last point before I end is you brought the issues of AUKUS and Quad. And I think both this minilateralism, particularly after what is happening in Washington, what is happening in Gaza, what is happening, as you have mentioned, about Iran and the Iran equation, I think this sort of minilateralism in the Pacific is no longer going to work effectively. AUKUS is more about transactional military supply, military and strategic supplies. But if you look Quad, I mean, this is a sheer asymmetry where you get to see that Japan sitting between China and United States will never wage a war. Look at Australia, it's like 10,000 kilometers waterways. I mean, they only have a job to control or perhaps protect their maritime transportation system. And India is, as I mentioned, is heavily interdependent on, dependent rather, on Beijing's supply chain. So therefore, I think the whole exercise of minilateralism is perhaps one of the features that was running for last few years is in the verge of erosion. And with that note, I think the fundamental change that has taken place since the Kashmir issue is that the reversal and perhaps the renewed geopolitical equation in which all these countries have to really reconfigure their foreign policy, strategic relations, and defense relations. And I think Bangladesh is having a very good relationship with Beijing, talking about modernization of its military systems. It is talking to the Americans about the tariff and everything. And I think that gives you a role model of a country which has never been into conflict with anyone over the past 54 years of its independence, yet has been able to maintain a reasonable relationship with not only the neighbors, but also the externals. Thank you.
That's a great point, Dr. Shahab. The only thing that I would say to that is, unfortunately, in the case of Pakistan, much like any other country, we don't really get to choose our neighbors, right? We are, I remember about 6 months back, somebody said this statistic, and they said that if you were to look at the land boundary of Pakistan, and this was right after the Iran missile strike that they conducted inside of Balochistan, and then we struck back, both sides attacking BLA, evidently. And someone said that if you were to look at the land borders of Pakistan, 92% of the land borders are with potentially hostile nations. And one of them, Dr. King, I'll come to you in just a second, but Amna, one of those nations, we've spoken about the eastern border, but we also have a western front, which seems to be getting worse with time. We thought on August 15, 2021, that we would have a favorable government in Kabul, that they would listen to us. The government, first of all, didn't really end up in Kabul, it's in Kandahar. And B, it seems that they are very focused on doing whatever they feel is the right move, and their negotiation tactic predominantly consists of ensuring that you don't get what you want. So by the time they actually do end up agreeing with something, it feels like some kind of capitulation. You were in Afghanistan recently. There's a bunch of different developments that have happened very recently. The first one of them being in February, there was this whole kind of kerfuffle about how there might be a civil war. We had Stanakzai and all of these guys and Qari Fasiuddin go to the UAE. Then there was this entire movement that happened about whether or not the girls' education might open back up, because there were a lot of dissent that was happening within Afghanistan. And more recently, Trump's assertion that he wants Bagram Air Base back, and conspiracy theorists are now talking about how Bagram would actually be the counterweight to Pakistan that has nuclear power and capable of striking Israel. And of course, there's going to be as many opinions as there are people in the room. But if we were to put all of that together, and given the 4+ year history with the IEA of them not really listening to us, them not being able to, or not really willing to rein in the TTP, and Pakistan continuing to suffer the effects of cross-border terrorism, particularly in the NMD region, and particularly in Balochistan, the same regions that are incredibly important from an economic point of view, both to China's long-term supply chain plans, as well as the minerals deal that we might be striking with the US. How do we balance all of this, given this very sort of volatile actor in the mix? My apologies.
First of all, thank you. It's great to be the only woman in a man panel, but thank you. Actually, you've put me in a bit of a fix because the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan, I think we need to understand it from the historical perspective. It's not just limited to the Afghan Taliban. The problems that we have had with Kabul, say, for the past 20 years are exactly the same problems that we're facing with the Afghan Taliban. And I've always said that unless and until we do not go back to the roots and solve those historical bilateral irritants, we will continue to face these problems. The only difference is that you'll have a new regime in Kabul and the actors will change. The TTP, in this case, has been consistent. And I think this is the major issue between both the countries. Look, I do understand that security is a major facet of the bilateral relationship, but I think this is a mistake that has been made, where we've always approached Afghanistan through the security spectrum. And as a consequence of that, I think other areas of the bilateral relationship haven't evolved, and hence we don't have that kind of influence now in Afghanistan in terms of addressing the TTP issue. Now here, I'm going to make two very important points. One is that, yes, the onus is on the Afghan Taliban to deliver when it comes to any terrorist entity that threatens the region. They themselves agreed to this in the Doha Agreement. Now, we can criticize the Doha Agreement for how good or bad it is, but the fact is that they endorsed it, the Americans endorsed it, and we, the region, endorsed it. So yes, the onus is on the Afghan Taliban. I think they are being disingenuous when they say that they don't have control or they don't have leverage. I don't want to get into the history, but you know that we had a ceasefire that was able to come about because the Afghan Taliban used their influence. Time and again, they've told us that they will relocate the TTP, which again is a non-starter because you relocate them to a different province. That doesn't mean that you're going to solve the problem. So yes, the onus is on the Afghan Taliban, but at the same time, I am going to say something that is slightly controversial, and I do understand it. I'm from erstwhile Fatah, so I do understand the sentiments and the sensitivities that come with what I'm going to say. But look, at the end of the day, when we say Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, we are, yes, we've changed the name to Khawarij, but at the end of the day, it's the TTP. We are owning up to the fact that they're Pakistani. And I think there has to be an indigenous approach to this. Having said so, what is that indigenous approach? The approach is that it's not popular, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to move towards some sort of negotiations. I know it's not popular. I know they've committed immense atrocities, and every day our security personnel are being killed. But I think this is something that really needs to be looked into, because if you see any conflict in any part of the world, dialogue is always there. And I understand the frustrations, but I really feel that the government and all the stakeholders need to come together and focus on this, because look, when the ceasefire ended back in, I believe, November 2022, we didn't really have a session in Parliament to discuss what do we do next. So I really think that there has to be an indigenous approach to this. Now, coming to Afghanistan, look, I think it's a little unfair because the international community seems to be more preoccupied by what's happening, say, in Ukraine. The Americans are obsessed with the Chinese, and of course, we're seeing the genocide in Gaza. So the past, 4 years have been allowed to continue. It's become the status quo. In any democratic part of the world, a 4-year term is a full term. So I think the Afghan Taliban are very comfortable in this current status quo. I think that there isn't enough regional or international push on the Afghan Taliban to deliver. Even if we go back to the basics of the Doha Agreement, if any party has benefited from the Doha Agreement, it has primarily been the Taliban, and then it's been the Americans because the troops were not being killed. Here, again, I want to stress that Afghanistan is a country that has always had global ramifications. And do we really need to wait for something to happen again for the world to divert its attention back to Afghanistan? Therefore, Afghanistan, it's a collective responsibility, and I really feel that the tools that can be used to convince and even pressurize the Afghan Taliban to deliver, whether it's human rights, it's women's rights, whether it's counterterrorism or other means, they're not being used fully. And in this situation, Pakistan is stuck in the middle, because whether we like it or not, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, because of our association with them. But again, here I will say that right now, I think for the Afghan Taliban, there is no domestic opposition. I think it is a historical opportunity for the Afghan Taliban, if they actually want to become stakeholders, if they want to be accepted as a responsible member of the international community to deliver. And if you want to be a responsible member of the international community, then you have to deliver on certain norms. And unfortunately, they're not delivering. And Pakistan is stuck in the middle. It's a very complex and interdependent relationship, and things will continue this way.
Yep.
Unless and until, we find some sort of a bilateral approach where we address our historical bilateral irritants.
No, those are great points. Thank you, Amna. I, at one point, used to be of the opinion that if you were to bring security to Afghanistan, trade would follow. Increasingly, I'm now of the opinion that if you bring trade to Afghanistan, security will just automatically follow. And that's something that maybe you can comment on a little bit later. And I do agree with you in that the regional cohesion, when it comes to placing demands or coherent demands on the IEA, is completely lacking. Every country is focused on its own needs, its own wants, how they want to function with them, how they want to work with them. And you're right, a 4+ year long government in any part of the world is considered a democratic government. This is the same point, Adam, that you and I have discussed in the past about how a lot of times when we sit together and talk about regional dynamics, we start to debate reality as opposed to accepting what has happened, recognizing that they are the ones in power, and whether you like it or not, you have to talk to them. Perhaps not the TTP part of it, but at the very least the Afghan Taliban, and find a way to move forward. Dr. King, we've spoken already about the Bagram base. You must find yourself these days at a very, odd kind of crossroads as a professor of foreign service who teaches young diplomats, the kind of behavior you need to exhibit around the world in a very volatile administration, in a very volatile environment. With now, there seems to be this press from the Trump administration to get Bagram back. And of course, that raises a lot of eyebrows because people think that, okay, maybe the US wants to come back to Afghanistan, maybe it just wants to use it as a forward base to mitigate Chinese interests, maybe it is a move against Pakistan. What does all of this mean? And regionally speaking, will this move actually add to the overall security umbrella within the region, or just serve as a distraction for us to debate and sort of create discourse around without really getting anywhere?
So you mean the move back to Afghanistan in which way?
Yep.
So more U.S. involvement again with the Afghan regime? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Sorry, my question was, with the Trump administration, Trump very specifically saying that he wants the Bagram Air Base back, he's made multiple tweets about it. There are now fears that the U.S. might be coming back to Afghanistan. When last NATO and ISAF forces were in Afghanistan, of course, Pakistan suffered a great deal as a frontline ally in the war against terror. The counterbalance to that point is that maybe if the U.S. is back in that region, it can counteract ISKP by having foot intelligence on the ground. It can counteract the TTP, which acts against Pakistani interests, and the 5 or 6 Uzbek jihadist groups that also exist in the region. What does all of this mean? Is there a realistic possibility of the U.S. coming back to Afghanistan, and what kind of effect that will have on regional stability?
Right, I think that given the fact that the way that Trump thinks is so transactional, that it is a real possibility that he might re-engage in that region. But I think in the end, he wants to be seen as a peacemaker in the region. And so I think, given that, it won't get to the point where he will, move in any way against, the Pakistani interests, for example. It's just really a transactional arrangement And I don't think he's really playing a long game. You know, I don't think he'll see like a strategic, long-term reason for wanting to do that, right? And if he can't justify it, he's not thinking several moves ahead. You know, he's being, you know, very shallow in that way. And one thing that he has never done, and frankly, a lot of the neoconservatives have never done, is they do not really rely on the expertise or think the expertise is valid of the regional specialists. So you have the regional specialists, for example, in the State Department, you know, who have been purged. Those people who know the culture and the language, those people who would be thinking ahead, are not the people that are being relied on anymore. And so I think from just a pure short-run, short-term gain perspective, it's not the sort of thing that the Trump administration would want to pursue in order, you know, to re-engage in Bagram in that way.
Adam, that's a great point that Dr. King just raised. One of the things that we were speaking about on our ride from Islamabad to Lahore was the dysfunction that exists between the strategic autonomy that we spoke about as far as India is concerned and their actual tactical intervention when it came to May. I think the purpose of that entire exercise was to try and see whether or not they could act in the same kind of manner as Israel to attack another country's infrastructure, mosques, cities, air bases, without any kind of repercussions internationally. But what they found very swiftly was that Pakistan was tactically very sound, strategically silent, reserved, and disciplined, and was able to counteract them. How does that affect regional dynamics within South Asia? How do you see the relationship, particularly as, you know, Bihar elections are coming up, the Modi government continues to stay in power? How does that affect the region? And with these newer developments that are happening in the Middle East, you were, of course, in Syria very recently. How does that shifting power dynamic affect this part of the world and vice versa?
Well, that's a big question. Well, first of all, I guess I would say that the United States often talks about the rules-based order, and the United States and Europe often criticize this part of the world. And I would say, you know, speaking personally, you shouldn't accept too much criticism from the United States or Europe. I think we've shown how dysfunctional we are, both within our own borders and around the world, and that the so-called rules-based order is a bit of a facade. So I'll start there. In terms of authoritarianism, of course, authoritarianism is growing around the world. We see it in India, we see it in the United States in some respect. The Israeli government as it exists is authoritarian in many ways, and of course, the rest of the Middle East has been authoritarian. You know, that has a certain type of effect on international relations. In some ways, authoritarian leaders in systems where they can retain power for years and years or even decades offer a certain amount of stability because they can engage in long-term strategic thinking. They don't have to adhere to a 4-year election cycle the way the United States does. And it's actually interesting because the current administration is engaging in certain types of populism and authoritarian tactics at home, but at least in theory, will adhere to a 4-year election cycle, which is one of the reasons that they don't engage in kind of long-term thinking, because they don't really have the time to. You know, 2 years into an administration, you're already really thinking about the next election, and even before that, you're thinking about midterms often. So,
but in this particular case, there are no. I mean, under the current rules, there are no next elections for Trump, right? And what Dr. King said in terms of the transactional nature of it, how does that then play out?
Well, there's next elections for MAGA, and that's how Trump thinks about things. I mean, he is quite transactional. And look, I'll give a little bit of praise to the administration in that I think the transactionalism has allowed them to do some bold things. For example, they at least suspended sanctions on Syria. I don't think that a typical administration would have done that so quickly. They met with Ahmed al-Shara, the new Syrian leader. I don't think a typical administration, they would have been far too worried about the optics. He was willing to negotiate directly with the Taliban. A traditional administration would not have done that. I don't think President Biden would have left Afghanistan had it not been for the Doha Agreement that was negotiated by Trump. So sometimes the boldness and transactionalism of President Trump can achieve great things. The problem is that they don't follow a process. They don't have an interagency process. They don't really have a policy-making process.
Dictatorial.
it's dictatorial, but not in the way that, for example, you know, there's only one man who really matters in China, but that man follows a process. Okay, we have one man who matters and he doesn't follow a process. And so things just come out of the White House out of nowhere, and sometimes they're real and sometimes they're not real. And it's hard to say when they matter. And I think the Trump administration lacks the kind of patience that is required to engage in serious long-term diplomacy. And we've seen that in their approach to negotiations on Ukraine. We've seen that in their approach with in negotiations on Gaza. We've seen that elsewhere as well, and they lack follow-through sometimes because they don't, as was just said, they don't respect expertise for one, they don't have a process, and they don't necessarily have follow-through even when they have big ideas, even when they're willing to take action. In terms of what effect these changes have on this region, I think India is now viewed in the West as at least an unreliable actor, a somewhat irresponsible actor. And that's a dangerous thing for the region. And I think what Israel has done in Gaza has also shifted the goalpost. And we were talking about this, that India, in some ways, might have thought it could replicate some of what Israel did. It could have impunity in terms of the kinds of strikes it engages in against its neighbor under the guise of security. And you know, unlike Gaza, Pakistan has an air force. So things went differently. But I do think we're living in an era where the threshold for state violence has increased. I mean, you see Israel conducting a strike in Doha, which would have been unimaginable. Yep. You see Israel conducting strikes in the middle of Damascus. You see what happened between India and Pakistan. And frankly, you see what Russia did to Ukraine. Yep. And so the goalposts have been shifted. And that's very dangerous for the world, especially when there aren't as many diplomatic off-ramps as there should be. And so I think, you know, I think for the world it's destabilizing. For Pakistan, it probably presents an opportunity. I think the transactionalism of the Trump administration might be quite good for Pakistan if it knows how to play things right. Because if you look at the history of U.S.-Pakistan relations, at least in the last 20 years, they were transactional, but they were done, these transactions were conducted in a very technocratic way with Washington and, you know,
Lugar bill.
Yeah, and the president often felt that they were they were sort of blocked by Congress in certain ways. I mean, the Kerry-Lugar bill wasn't necessarily something that the White House wanted at the time. And so, or at least not as it was written. So now we have a unrestrained president for the time being, depending on what happens in midterms. And I think that actually presents an opportunity for Pakistan. And this war with India presents an opportunity for Pakistan as well in terms of the way that Pakistan's image has been somewhat rebranded by it. But one thing that Pakistan does have to remember about the legacy of that war and the current state of relations between India and the United States is that the reason India is willing to challenge the United States and isolate itself from the United States is because it does have the economy to back that up. It does have the independence to back that up. The reason Pakistan has to maintain this balancing act between China and the United States, to put it bluntly, is because it doesn't. So I think Pakistan needs to always remain focused on its own development, its own developing itself into a regional actor that takes care of business at home first and isn't solely focused on how it is perceived by the rest of the world or its usefulness to other countries from a foreign policy perspective.
No, those are all great points. Dr. Shahab, I noticed that you were furiously writing some notes. I'm sure you have plenty to say to what Adam said, so I'll just give you the floor.
No, I thank you very much. I think Adam is absolutely right when it comes to transactionality and the current administration's position. I think I will be extremely cautious about a few things. The first one is when everything becomes transactional, it's not going to be a long-term stuff. I mean, which means the geopolitical equation that we are talking about, I mean, Pakistan, Middle East, India, United States, India, China, is going to be morphing anytime soon. I mean, that depends on how Washington really continues. And that's where the whole term of continuity comes in. And this is where everyone is really uncertain whether there will be continuity. Even if you look at the case of India that Adam was talking about, and absolutely correct. But look at, if you see it from Delhi's point of view, right? Even if the relationship with Washington improves between BJP government and the Republicans, I think the trust deficit that has come in between these two countries will remain for a long, long time to come. And I don't think that is a great news for the Americans when they're thinking about their Indo-Pacific strategy and so on. Then, of course, the question of populism comes in. I mean, populism. I mean, because now the foreign policy or the different strategies that we are talking about, I mean, we want the Bagram to be returned, we want to make certain place French Riviera and so on. You know, everything is a part of populist narratives. And we have seen in South Asia that populism won't last longer, starting from Colombo to Dhaka to Kathmandu. And I'm wondering who's next. So therefore, I think that kind of a whole ecosystem, social ecosystem, political ecosystem, is undergoing an absolute U-turn that we never anticipated over the past many years. And I think Zeeshan works on artificial intelligence and technology, and you can see that how it is changing the entire system, that even you can't predict what will happen within the next 3 months. I mean, it is extremely difficult. You take ChatGPT is now 5, tomorrow it will be 7, and the moment the Americans release one platform, the Chinese are going to release within 7 days another platform, making sure that the tech industries are essentially becoming much more crippled. I mean, that tells you that the whole social ecosystem, which always been out of this discussion about political system or the defense or foreign policy, is now factoring in. And look at the whole issue of UNGA over the past 1 week. I mean, that's a wake-up call for everyone. I mean, look at the way everyone was reacting to Gaza. And subsequently that certain countries are becoming isolated, and they have chosen. I mean, and the acts and deeds of these countries are making some countries pariah or some countries to become much more strategically important, may not remain as the same case in the coming years. So what does it mean? It means this is the unique opportunity in global system that where we can actually talk about the democratizing the Security Council. Now, whether it will happen or not, that's a separate issue, because Adam is absolutely right. When we look into the rules-based order, I mean, the Chinese have talked about rules-based order in their own term. The West has talked about it in their own term. And this is when you are seeing that neither of these rules-based orders are essentially catering to the need of the countries. Those are growing at a faster pace, including Pakistan or India or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Japan, whichever you're talking about. So I think one critical lesson for us, I mean, from Adam's point of view and looking from a very South Asian perspective, that we really need to think about our own rules-based system. And how do we do that? This is the alternative system, and this is where I think the Gulf countries and Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, if India is willing to come in, and nobody stops India from coming. It is the Indian political choice that how they want to respond to it, going back to the fundamental theory of populism, how long populism's point of view, and looking from a very South Asian perspective, that we really need to think about our own rules-based system. And how do we do that? This is the alternative system, and this is where I think the Gulf countries and Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, if India is willing to come in, and nobody stops India from coming. It is the Indian political choice that how they want to respond to it, going back to the fundamental theory of populism, how long populism will continue to determine the Indian foreign policy and so on. And the last point, and I think which is extremely important for everyone to understand, that what Kashmir has given the world in terms of security. The first thing that the Western dominance over the military hardware is now being questioned.
It is now being?
Question.
Question.
I mean, look at if I'm seeing it from Dhaka, or if I'm seeing it Colombo, I'm seeing it from, Tanzania or somewhere. I mean, the first time I now have an option. Battle-tested military hardware coming from China. I mean, now how are you going to really dictate the countries that, okay, well, the Chinese hardware, no, you don't go for the Chinese hardware, but how are you going to tell it? I mean, this is battle-tested. PL-15, J-10, whatever the aircrafts are coming, the radar system. I think this is going to be a major, major issue for the countries like Bangladesh, who needs to diversify their military hardware. Because I have a very interesting neighbors. I mean, for the first time in our 54 years of history, we have a new border neighbor, I mean, which is not controlled by Myanmar, which is controlled by the ethnic armed group, which is Arakan Army. So what it means, that even if you look the cartography, it's changing so fast that even if you look at what is happening in Northeast India, it gives us a sheer bone-chilling effect that how far are we going to withstand all this conflict, economies rising in our neighborhood. So what it means that the entire defense structure, entire military structure, security structure is going through a change where how Bangladesh, how Pakistan, how even India are going to sustain their existing sovereign autonomy or strategic autonomy over their defense system or cross-regional relationship is something that will be very volatile. And I'm not too sure where the answer lies. But essentially what I get to see is that what seems to be a beautiful reality right now, that the world has changed, is not going to be a sustainable reality that we are seeing. I'm sorry.
No, that's a great point, Dr. Shahab. And Dr. King, I would very much like for you to come in at this point. Because the thing that we've spoken about consistently is this, this rule-based order, how international politics and international governance was supposed to work.
Just to one, I mean, since a lot of them are young, I mean, I couldn't resist my temptation of telling. There's a term called new normal.
Yeah.
And this discontinuity, continuity debate, and this idea of long-term thoughts, except for Beijing being a separate entity, having a communist ideology in the forefront of its state ideology. None of the states are actually following any kind of state ideology, except for the Chinese. And that's why the Chinese remains consistent. So the new normal for everyone who's sitting here, who's listening, is that the volatility and continuity, discontinuity within short term is going to be the new reality. And we have to accept that fact, and we have to be resilient of that kind of shocks and, volatilities that will rule our life in the coming months.
Makes sense. Dr. King, how do you respond to that in terms of the diversification of your security apparatus, particularly in this part of the world, the changing dynamics of the rules-based order around the world, the current state of international governance and how what we thought was, a just system effectively lying in tatters, the UN Security Council being entirely controlled by one veto vote and being completely unable to effectively stop wartime conditions in certain parts of the world. What does all of this mean? And how, from a foreign policy perspective, how do you rationalize the short-term gains, but effectively long-term losses that this kind of a new geopolitical reality is going to bring about? No easy questions.
So I think that faith in international institutions has really been shaken. Certainly at the United Nations level, when it comes to the issues of, say, the permanent deadlock on the National Security Council, for example, not being able to move forward with that. Just a lot of impatience with, as you said, the rules-based order. And so what I think becomes then so important is other aspects of diplomacy. Then it comes when other actors must be brought to the table who are equally important, and those actors include, in the international system, the multinational corporations, for example. Another group that I've thought about is highly, what I call super empowered individuals. You know, people that run foundations like Gates, you know, other billionaires. You know, it's really devolved from the point of like a state-based system into a system where there's many other parts of society that are becoming more and more influential. You know, and another that could be spoken of, and I know here that's important, say to the Punjab group, is the role of universities as well.
Yep.
As another major actor in world affairs. So when you think about the rules-based order, that's certainly just based on a conception really of state power. And I think over time, state power is diminished and is given, it's yielding to other areas like trade, other areas like philanthropy, other areas like education that are bringing people together. So we need to look more to those other apparatuses to think about how we're going to move forward. And this is really more consistent, of course, with the youth and their perspectives.
Yep, absolutely. And, you know, speaking of commonalities, one of the things that we discussed earlier, for example, was, you know, if there's a flood in Kabul River, climate change, for example, does not really care about your borders, right? It doesn't care about your Durand line or, you know, what kind of border exists between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's going to flood the river. It's going to affect communities along the river. The same is the case with any river system that we share with India. Those rivers and climate change does not care where the line of control is. So climate change, to me, seems like a very clear opportunity for a lot of these, you know, nations that might be otherwise at odds, Pakistan and Afghanistan, Pakistan and India, for example, to work together because some of these shared objectives really need to be, you know, capitalized upon. Do you see, Amna, any kind of movement or possibility or hope for these commonalities to be established, say from the perspective of Pakistan's relationship with the Afghan Taliban and everything that is happening with Kabul and Kandahar, or do the bigger issues? Currently, the lens is completely security focused. Before August 15th, it was very much trade focused. But if we were to step back from that and think of it in terms of let's not have negotiations around these very friction-based kind of topics. Let's talk more about, you know, things that we can easily bridge paths towards. What would some of those things be, and if there's any possibility to move in that direction?
If I may, I wanted to make a quick point before I answer your question regarding this impunity that, and this is something very close to my heart, that we have seen, you know, with the Israeli government. And then, of course, India is following too with what it's doing with its Muslim population. It's very difficult then for the international community to hold a de facto government like the Afghan Taliban accountable when it comes to human rights or women's rights. And when we, you know, it's very fancy to use these terms, gender apartheid, but when we're seeing what we're seeing, a genocide happening in Palestine, I think it becomes extremely difficult, A, to hold the Afghan Taliban accountable, number one. And something else that I think is more concerning is that this is giving precedence to countries as well as non-state actors to do what they want to do. And then how will we will we be able to hold one accountable when we're not clearly holding a so-called democratic state accountable? So I just wanted to make this point because I think it was important.
Absolutely.
Now, coming to your view on the relationship, you know, it's interesting that Pakistan and Afghanistan are two very interdependent countries that have a very complex relationship. And this always reminds me of what Hamid Karzai said, that, you know, they're conjoined twins. And we don't seem to realize that actually when you're conjoined twins, it's a very difficult relationship, you know. So I think that defines it very well. But despite the fact that it's so interdependent and complex, we, till date, have not had a comprehensive bilateral framework to engage with one another. Whether it's through water, by the way, we don't have a water sharing agreement with the Afghan Taliban, even though the Iranians do, and they've had problems with them on the Helmand River. But yes, this is certainly something that's going to come up. So whenever there is a bilateral issue between both countries, what happens? Unilateral actions are taken on both sides. And hence, the problem exasperates. Now, interestingly, Afghanistan has signed a strategic partnership agreement with India back in 2011. They also signed a strategic partnership agreement with the Iranians, again back, I think it was in 2010 or 2011. And it just bewilders me that these two countries that are so interdependent don't have anything. So unless and until there isn't, again, some sort of a comprehensive bilateral framework where both countries can engage on a broad-based spectrum, not just security, trade, you know, people to people, culture, water,
Technology, health,
anything,
education, whatever, yeah.
climate change. I mean, it's a never-ending list of areas that both countries need to engage on. We still don't have it. We did try with APAPS, the Afghanistan-Pakistan Action Plan for Peace and Solidarity. That in itself is such a mouthful. It didn't work. So I think pending formal recognition, really both countries need to focus on this. And coming to the aspect of trade, look, it's very interesting. Trade and security go hand in hand. They're not isolated from one another, but unfortunately, in this particular bilateral relationship, security is paramount for us, but trade is a lifeline for Afghanistan. And I think these are both interdependent, because you can't have security without trade, and you can't have trade without security. Pakistan very recently, I have to say, did pursue the request of the Afghan Taliban, where they said, okay, fine, we're going to work hand in hand with trade and politics, or rather trade and security. And I just want to give you some figures. Recently, a PTA was signed between both of them, and from about 70%, that was initially the tariff for Afghan, fruits and vegetables that were perishable, this has been reduced to 27%. So this is a major leverage that we gave them. Of course, in return, then we expected them to support us or help us in terms of at least reducing the attacks that are taking place by the TTP. I'm not saying that they are completely in the hands of the Afghan Taliban, but certainly attacks are taking place, and the TTP are very much in Afghanistan. We haven't seen that happening. So again, trade and security, of course, you can create economic interdependence, and it does reduce the chances of conflict. But at the end of the day, you have to have willingness from both sides. And unfortunately, we're not seeing this from the Afghan Taliban yet. They've adopted a compartmentalized approach where they seem to be giving precedence to one regional country over the other. And that's not going to work. It's a very short-term measure. So again, I think it's time for the Afghan Taliban to revisit their policies. But having said so, despite the complexity of the relationship, Pakistan and Afghanistan need to develop a bilateral relationship that is based on sovereignty and accepting the other as an independent and very sovereign state, which unfortunately we haven't seen.
Thank you, Amna.